On August 22, 2025, a horrific and senseless act of violence shocked the city of Charlotte, North Carolina. A young woman, Iryna Zarutska, just 23 years old, was brutally stabbed to death on the city's light rail system, the Lynx Blue Line. Iryna was not just another victim, she was a refugee who had fled the war in Ukraine, seeking safety and a new beginning in the United States. Instead, she became the face of a tragedy that has raised urgent questions about public safety, mental health, and the vulnerability of those trying to rebuild their lives in unfamiliar places. Welcome to Crime Cam. Born and raised in Ukraine, Iryna lived through the chaos of the Russian invasion that began in 2022. Like millions of others, she was forced to flee her home in search of safety. For Iryna, that journey led her across the ocean to the United States. Iryna settled in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she tried to start over. Those who knew her described her as kind, determined, and profoundly hopeful for her future. She was learning English, connecting with her community, and working to build a life far from the war she had escaped. For many, Iryna represented the resilience of the Ukrainian people. Unfortunately, her life was stolen in a violent act she could never have expected. On the evening of August 22nd, Iryna boarded the Lynx Blue Line light rail train near the East-West Boulevard station around 9:46 p.m. Surveillance video later showed her sitting quietly, just another passenger on a typical night. But within minutes, her life would end. According to investigators, another passenger, later identified as 34-year-old DeCarlos Brown Jr., approached her. Without saying a word, he suddenly pulled out a knife and stabbed her 3 times, one of the wounds fatally striking her in the neck. The attack was described as completely unprovoked. Witnesses on the train were horrified, with some rushing to get help as others tried to shield themselves from the violence. The train made an emergency stop and police quickly arrived at the scene. Despite attempts to save her, Iryna was pronounced dead shortly after. The man accused of killing Iryna Zarutska is DeCarlos Brown Jr., a 34-year-old Charlotte resident with a troubled past. Reports indicate that Brown has a long history of mental illness and previous encounters with law enforcement. Police say the stabbing appeared to have no apparent motive. Iryna and Brown were strangers, and there was no sign of an argument or confrontation before the attack. Authorities believe it was a random act of violence carried out in public, which has made the crime all the more terrifying for the community. Brown was arrested the same night and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors are considering additional charges related to carrying a deadly weapon and endangering passengers. If convicted, he could face life in prison, or even the death penalty under North Carolina law. Beyond the immediate tragedy, this case raises significant and complex questions. Why was someone like DeCarlos Brown Jr., reportedly struggling with mental illness, able to move freely without proper treatment or supervision? Could more have been done to prevent this attack? According to his family, Brown began hearing voices years ago. He believed that people were controlling him, and at times he thought strange man-made materials inside his body were forcing him to act against his will. Brown's run-ins with the law span more than a decade. Reports show at least 14 arrests, with charges ranging from armed robbery, larceny, theft, breaking and entering, assault, including against his own sister, and misuse of 911. In 2015, he was sentenced to over 5 years in prison for armed robbery with a dangerous weapon. He was released in 2020, but instead of rehabilitation, his condition worsened. Brown's run-ins with the law span more than a decade. Reports show at least 14 arrests, with charges ranging from armed robbery, larceny, theft, breaking and entering, assault, including against his own sister, and misuse of 911. In 2015, he was sentenced to over 5 years in prison for armed robbery with a dangerous weapon. He was released in 2020, but instead of rehabilitation, his condition worsened. In a recorded jailhouse phone call after the incident, Brown told his sister that he believed the materials in his body had lashed out against Iryna. He insisted he did not know her and that he had not planned the stabbing. Instead, he described it as something beyond his control, a product of his delusional thinking. This statement reinforced what his family had long feared. His untreated mental illness had reached a dangerous breaking point. Brown now faces first-degree murder charges in North Carolina. In addition, federal prosecutors charged him with causing death on a mass transportation system, a grave offense under U.S. law. If convicted, he could spend the rest of his life in prison. But the case will likely hinge on his mental competency. The tragedy of Iryna Zarutska's death is not just about one man's crime. It is also about the failures of the system. Why was a man with severe schizophrenia, multiple arrests, and a history of violence left unsupervised in public? Why was his mental health evaluation delayed and never completed? And how many warnings from his family and past behavior were ignored? These are the questions now being asked in North Carolina and across the country. The case of DeCarlos Brown Jr. is a chilling reminder of what happens when mental health systems fail, when the justice system drops the ball, and when people who desperately need help don't get it. A young woman lost her life in the most brutal way possible. A man with severe mental illness now faces murder charges, and both their families are left grappling with grief and unanswered questions. What do you think could have been done to prevent this? Should there be more security on public transportation, or better systems to treat people struggling with mental illness? Share your thoughts in the comments below.